Oh, well, I really don't want to go into all of the details about the sense impressions here, but I do want to sort of finish the story. And this, the key passage is over on page 3 of the handout. It's from section 59. Here then is the denouement. I've suggested a number of times that although it would be most misleading to say that concepts pertaining to thinking are theoretical concepts now, yet their status might be illuminated by means of the contrast between theoretical and non-theoretical discourse. We're now in a position to see exactly why this is so. Both halves, why it would be misleading now to characterize them as theoretical entities, and why the contrast is illuminating. I mean, let me mention, maybe this is obvious, but what a conceptual leap he had to take to think of Cartesian pensées, the paradigmatically observable thing, the thing that cannot be there without being observed, because they're, it's not just you're incorrigible. If you think it's there, then it's there. It's that if it's there, you know that it's there as well. To have the idea that those might be theoretical entities, that the way to understand the use of those concepts is to think of them as introduced as theoretical entities only available inferentially. That's a huge intellectual move that he's making there. For once, our fictitious ancestor Jones has developed the theory that overt verbal behavior is the expression of thoughts, and taught his compatriots to make use of the theory in interpreting each other's behavior. It's but a short step to use this language in self-description. So when Tom watching Dick has behavioral evidence which warrants the use of the sentence in the language of the theory, Dick is thinking that P. Dick, using the same behavioral evidence, can now in the language of the theory say, I am thinking of P, or I am thinking that, I am thinking P, or I am thinking that P. And now, in again one of his most famous sentences, he says, and it now turns out, need it have, that Dick can be trained to give reasonably reliable self-descriptions using the language of the theory, without having to observe his overt behavior. Jones brings this about roughly by applauding utterances by Dick of I am thinking that P, when the behavioral evidence strongly supports the theoretical statement, Dick is thinking that P, and by frowning on utterances of I am thinking that P, when the evidence does not support this theoretical statement. And in that way, he trains Dick to respond differentially reliably to the presence of a thought by making the claim, I am thinking that P. Our ancestors began to speak of the privileged access that each has to his own thoughts, because you can be trained to do that in your own case and not in other people's case. That's the only sense of privileged access. What began as a language with a purely theoretical use has gained a reporting role. And just by describing the practices of using this, all this is happening in the pragmatic meta-language here. You can see how this could happen. As we say, that Pluto started life as a theoretical entity and became observable. People had to be taught to notice, but it turns out that they could. And now one wants to say, well, what about that parenthetical rhetorical question? Need it have turned out this way? Sellars doesn't think he needs to answer that. He thinks it's obvious. He can just ask that, oh, think about that a little bit. What do you think the answer is? Need it have turned out? Either by Sellars' lights or in fact? I mean, I find it infuriating that he left this hanging. As I say, he thinks the answer is obvious. really is a rhetorical question for him.
Is the question, so there's like a modal there, and so there's two possible questions. One is like, need it have turned out that in fact Dick is trained to give these self-descriptions? And I think there the answer is probably no. And then there's the, need it have turned out that Dick was trainable, that he was able to be trained. And I think there the answer is yes. I mean, the sentence doesn't make that clear, but I think that...
Well, it's a good decision, a good distinction, and I do think the second question is the one he's asking. And I want to say, well, it depends on who you're asking this question of. I think if we ask it in a reasonably transcendental question, that is, for any beings that could have, Rileyan ancestors and a Jones, need it have turned out that they could be trained to do this? The answer is no. It could have been this was a good theory, and as a matter of fact, the access that we in this large sense of rational beings who have to it, just remained at the theoretical level. Now, for biological human beings, maybe the way we're wired up, yes, that we're trainable to do this is sort of comes with us. So I actually think there's a substantive distinction between the Kantian version, need it have, if we're quantifying over all rational beings, or need it have for critters like us, where I think it's very plausible that the answer is yes, that it was possible for us to be trained like this, it is necessary.
But there are more questions to be asked, I think. Could beings who are not trainable in this way, as a matter of fact, acquire a language that is recognizably like ours?
Which is to say, a language. Could they have empirical knowledge? Could they know that things are thus and so?
Because I think the order in which Sellars presents this myth of Jones is one that is, in a certain sense of the word, arbitrary. He doesn't intend to make a statement about how things, in matter of fact, historically developed.
Right. He's very clear about that. It's a myth to illustrate the current status of these things, and to wean us from the picture of them being intrinsically observable. That is one piece of the Cartesian picture. I want to come back to this question a little bit about the needed have, but let me mention one more thing. I suggested that an interesting move that could be compared to Sellars' account of what we're doing in talking about how things merely look was the view I was attributing to Gareth Evans about how we could generate secondary quality concepts for any observational concepts. I think at this point in Sellars' story, it's very helpful to think of what Rorty went on to do with this, who in his account of incorrigibility as the mark of the mental, and then eliminative materialism, said, look, the essence of having a Cartesian mind is to be incorrigible about, in your sincere first-person reports of what you're thinking, let's say, for the paradigm pensées. But incorrigibility is a normative status. No one can be justified in overriding your claim. There is no evidence that would count would have the normative significance of overriding your sincere first-person avowal of what you were thinking. And normative statuses are always and everywhere, Rorty is going to say, we social pragmatists think, social statuses. That is, there needn't have been social practices of according unoverridable authority to sincere first-person avowals. Indeed, Aristotelians didn't. That's why they didn't have Cartesian minds as a category. Rorty here invokes a classic article called "Why Isn't the Mind-Body Problem Ancient?" He says, look, there was a time before we had Cartesian minds. We Hegelians know this was part of the rise of subjectivity with modernity. And Rorty's eliminative materialism is a thought experiment about what happens if we get good enough with cerebroscopes that it made sense to override and say, no, you're actually not thinking that. You're thinking something nearby. You just made a mistake. That change in social practices is intelligible. Well, there's a lot going on in all of that, but what I wanted to lay on the table in this connection was, just as Evans suggested how the social practices of using expressions could change so that we introduced a secondary quality concept corresponding to something that was merely observable like square, Rorty is describing how the social practices could change so that these inner episodes, these thoughts, could count not just as observable, but as incorrigibly observable. It just has to be that our practices are such that people are good enough at according with our theoretical attributions inferentially to them of thoughts, that at a certain point we say, no inferences that we could make count as having the authority to override these. Our practices will just be that if there's a collision between a theoretical attribution, well, it sure looks as though you're thinking such and such a thing. No, that really isn't what I was thinking. That our practices are to give the authority to the sincere first-person avowal. And then they'd be incorrigible. Not because of anything intrinsic about them. And what the social practices give, they can take away. They could change. That would be eliminative materialism. Eliminating Cartesian minds, not even Jonesian minds. People could still have thoughts and sense impressions, and certainly not Rileyan minds. So anyway, I find thinking of Sellars' progression. First, Jones postulates these things, and we can third-person attribute them to each other inferentially based on how they behave. And then second, it turns out we can learn how to self-attribute using the same theoretical inferential apparatus. And then third, it turns out we can, using that capacity, train people to make self-reports of these things, even in the cases where we don't have the theoretical access. We train them on the ones where we can, but it turns out that they can do it for more cases than we trained them on. And so now these things are observable for them. And now if we turn the Rortian crank on the social practices, we can see how they could become, have the normative status of being incorrigible, unoverridable for us. Most of that is not happening between people's ears. Most of that is happening in the social practices surrounding it. So sort of altogether, this is a really radical reconceptualization of Cartesian minds. He doesn't just give the destructive argument of the looks talk against a foundationalism. The second half of the essay is this constructive theorizing on his part about a theorizer Jones. Yeah, Tom.
How far can you take this sort of thinking without getting bogged down in the weeds of the sort of sense impression stuff that isn't entirely clear. I'm thinking of someone who objects to the claim that a physicist can learn to see a muon by saying, no, what you're really seeing is its vapor trail, just like by seeing in the sky a trail of an airplane without seeing, you have evidence that the airplane is there, but you didn't see the airplane, and that has something to do with sort of sense impression, non-inference versus noninferential disposition, something like that.
Well, you have to be careful,
Yeah.
Because this line of thought. So we've got a reliably co-varying causal chain of events that
Mhm.
connects you to all kinds of things.
Yeah.
And the question is, well, how distal can you get on that and still be saying that you're seeing it?
Right.
And the hard line, what goes with the two-ply notion here is, well, you can count as seeing anything in that chain. Which one are you seeing? Well, it depends what concept you apply. Am I seeing the rabbit? If the physiologist could tell you that actually what I was responding to was the rabbit flies that you only find around rabbits, but it turns out on this occasion that's what I saw, but there is this reliably covariant chain. Well, what I reported was the rabbit, not the rabbit flies. And on this account, you might not want to say you saw the rabbit, but I observed
Mhm.
the rabbit. If you insist that only things more proximal are visible, you're on a slippery slope to saying, well, all you're really observing is what states of your retina or something like that. You're more reliable the more proximal they are. This line, it's a clear thing to mean by seeing, is saying, well, it's a matter of what concept you're applying. Do you think you can see somebody on television? Can you see yourself in a mirror? These things came up in, maybe this is irrelevant, but the Vatican Office of Technology and Theology was set up in the 20s and the proximal question that it was set up to address was, given that if you heard the Pope's blessing in St. Peter's Square on Easter Sunday, you were blessed. What if you heard it live over the radio? Was the blessing transmitted that way? And they could see that there were going to be issues about this, and I've sort of given the game away. Their ruling in this case, 3 years later, was if it was live, not if it was recorded, that a recording of it wouldn't do it, but if you heard it live, you didn't actually have to be there, and his sound waves to your ears, they could go through this other medium as long as it was in real time. Well, this question about what you can literally see, people claimed to Galileo that he was not seeing through the telescope. You can't see through a telescope. Take the telescope away and I can't see it. Now, there are images in the telescope, we'll give you that, and maybe you want to make inferences about these things, but you can't see anything through that. He said, well, don't just look at the sky, look at the tower over there. Can't you see that? And, you recognize that, you can sort of see that, it's just bigger, isn't it? That's the sort of thing that people did to soften them up. So anyway, there's one clear thing to mean by seeing, but it goes all the way down to saying you're seeing the rabbit when maybe all that was actually visible was the rabbit flies. In the case I mentioned, maybe I didn't, the super blindsight case of the chicken sexers. All the newly hatched chicks are going by on the conveyor belt. You've got to sort them into the males and the females. It's a cult. It's difficult to tell, but people can be trained to do this. And there is a sort of sense impressions that go with this. And they discovered that actually, although everybody who did this believed that they saw, they sort of turn the chick over, look at the chick's bottom, and even though if you or I looked at them, males and the females looked just alike, they could tell the difference. But they discovered they were actually doing it by smell. They could do it in the dark, and they couldn't do it when they had a cold, and it just turned out they were doing it by smell, and they preferred not to think of it that way. But they were not seeing the difference between them. But they were observing the maleness and the femaleness of the chicks, as wrong as they were about even the sensory modality that they were using. So you were observing the rabbit. Were you exactly seeing? Well, you couldn't do it in the dark because it was visual to get as far as the flies, but that connection wasn't a visible one. Maybe our ordinary concepts just don't cut fine enough for that. But any clear notion will be okay as long as it isn't going to drive back to have us, having to infer everything from a world painted in secondary qualities, pushing it to retinal irradiations in Klein's term.
Yeah. So it seems unmysterious that somebody in this room could be able to make an observation report. The number of people in the room is 11. If someone can do that, is the integer 11 an observable? I mean,
I'm comfortable enough with that.
Okay.
And here's why. Of course, there's other alternatives one could give. It's not. It's the 11ness of people that is, but that's actually part of the number 11. On the only intentional logic, possible world semantics that can handle mathematical entities, which notoriously sort of standard possible world semantics can't, because they're all either necessarily false or necessarily true, and true in all possible worlds. So if you identify the proposition with a set of possible worlds it's true in, then but there is a variant one that treats the number 3 as varying from one possible world to another. The number 3 in this world is the set of all the triples in this world. So in this world, the 3 stooges are part of the number 3. And in a world in which there were 4 stooges, maybe that is the actual world, but anyway, or 5 or 6, the stooges are not part of the number 3. And now the claim that 3 plus 4 equals 7, while that's true in all these worlds, it means something different in this world than it means in those other worlds. It would be the number 11 in that sense that I would want to say, yeah, that's observable. But look, I think the lesson of Sellars' insistence that the question of what's theoretical and what's observable is methodological, and so tied to what instruments you've got, and that you can literally observe things through instruments, is that there aren't any a priori constraints on what's observable and what's not. It's just a question of what concepts we have and what RDRDs can be set up, where those RDRDs can go through sort of anything if they're reliable. That's the set of circumstances under which you're reliable, and that may include instruments and so on.
Good. So now, when one makes an observation report, of course, what one what one tokens as a sentence, are you thinking that you're willing to call observable anything that's the referent of a singular term which appears in an observation report?
No, I mean, it has to appear essentially in it as an observation report. There are all kinds of sort of auxiliary positions that something could have in an observation report, and you're not observing it. So the question is, which RDRDs are you exercising in doing this? And that's going to be some of them, not others. So there's issues like here, like the ones that come up when I'm reporting a tree over there that has leaves that are green, or that there is a tree over there, and so on. Sort of scope differences on what's got that observational status. And look, I should say, and I actually intended to say this earlier, when we were talking about the two dimensions of logical dependence in that passage of Sellars, the semantic dependence, interdependence really, of observation reports and inferentially arrived at empirical claims, including, we can now say, theoretical ones, with non-inferential reports, and the sense of non-inferential in which reports can be non-inferential, not the semantic sense, but the pragmatic sense. It's my view, and I think this is Sellars' view, but this is controversial, that I was reporting as saying, well, it's just a matter of whether you're exercising a reliable differential responsive disposition or not. That is, what makes it a non-inferential report is facts that are upstream in the elicitation of that actual act. That was my claim.
Okay.
That's the way I was reading the non-inferentiality of observation reports, saying it was reportings. For 25 years, McDowell went along with this. But he said he was never really comfortable with it. Absolutely agreed there were these two dimensions, and nothing conceptual could be non-inferential in this other sense. But what was the sense in which reports were non-inferential? And his current view, as I believe, is that it's not, in the first instance anyway, what happens upstream in the causal chain that actually elicits this. It's what's available to you downstream if you're challenged as to your justification for this report. That it's of the essence of non-inferential reports, of observation reports, that you can justify them by saying something like, well, I can see. That was just something I saw. Which is not to be construed as an inferential justification either of the form, well, it looked green to me and I inferred that it was green, or, as Sellars actually says when he's talking about this, inferential, Sellars' construal of these justifications, well, I'm a reliable reporter of green things under these circumstances and I reported it. So I'm justified. It's important to John that not be the form of the justification of these things. And he thinks that the distinctive kind of justification that is available to you for vindicating your entitlement to a non-inferential report, to an observation report, is what we should appeal to in picking out observation reports. Now he says, it may be that there's things we can always, that whenever that kind of justification is retrospectively available to you, that correlates with something that happened upstream, that you were, as a matter of fact, exercising a reliable differential responsive ability. But still, that's not what makes it an observation report. There's at least two different ways you could go, and Sellars tempts us with both of them, and with one that neither of us is attracted to, which is that the justification would always be an invocation of your own reliability, and so the justification would always be inferential. Neither John nor I thinks that is, in the end, what you ought to say about the justification ex post facto of one of your reports. Yeah, Tom?
So yeah, I was just thinking, is this an example of taking not the Chantier, whatever, the other passage, right? Talking about knowings as being standings in the space of reasons, of being able to justify. Is that the thought that John's having, that like, if you're calling it a non-inferential knowing, you're standing in space of reasons, it's just, I saw this, and that's what makes it the downstream thing rather than the upstream thing.
Well, I think I think there is a connection. I would say the connection is that he thinks that invoking your reliability is invoking something from, basically from outside. Well, he wouldn't put it that way either, but is invoking something from sort of the causal order in an inappropriate place.
Okay.
That's what I think he would say. Yeah.
Okay, so there's a question about the relation between observings that things are thus and so, and observings of objects. And I'm imagining that we might agree about what facts people are able to observe and what observation reports people make and can make. But we might disagree about what objects they can observe. Maybe we both think that this person is entitled to make this report, but one person says, well, and he's seeing Pluto, and the other person says, no, he's not seeing Pluto. What is that a disagreement about?
Okay. I mean, I think one important fact in the vicinity is that the seeing that locution is prior to the seeing of locution. But that means that there's a question, as you say, about making the transition from the one to the other. And it's clear that we can't just say, well, if there's a singular term that in fact refers to that thing in the observation report, that then it's seeing of, particularly not if we accept that there can be these cases where you're confused about what sensory modality it is that you're using. So you know non-inferentially that things are thus and so, but you may not be seeing anything from it. So I don't have a detailed story about that. I think there is room for different accounts of that, for saying what you're going to see. Okay, I had two more points here, one of which is important and one of which isn't very, but I think the important point I don't want to rush through, so I'm going to leave it for next time. But I will put all the notes there so that people can look at it if you want to, but it means I'll start off next time talking about the Phenomenalism essay. I want to warn you about the thing we're reading for next week, the counterfactuals, dispositions, and the causal modalities. It is Sellars' definitive for him treatment of modality, very important. Nobody else was writing anything like that at the time. Compared to this essay, everything else we've read is just lucid, just beautifully written and sequential and so on. This one is a real mess. And one of the reasons is that he didn't really sort out his view in the end. My advice in reading it is ignore everything he says, every paragraph in which the word probability occurs. I mean, there may be wonderful things in that and for other things, but for the treatment of modality, if he had just divided through by and just thought he does not need to talk about induction and probability in this same essay, it would have been a lot better. But there is gold in there, so anyway, be warned. It's even worse.
Let go all hope. You open this.
That's right. That's right.
I think I once tried to read that. I have a vague recollection that I tried to read it.
You repressed it.
Yeah, it was horrible. I don't like to talk about that thing. But I may have just skipped out of it when I saw the title, because I had this rabbit to fox reaction to logic. I try to run away from it.
Well, Rorty used to claim that as far as he could see, nothing of philosophical interest had ever happened within 3 feet in any direction of a quantifier symbol.